How's it going, YouTube? It's Richie here. I'm just going to give you a little playthrough of Kerbal Space Program. I'm going to be showcasing one or two things in it, one or two things I managed to do already, one or two things you can do, and just general having fun in space, really. Okay, so let's get started with it. If you're new to Kerbal Space Program, one of the first things you'll do after logging in, brief run through of what's what on it. And here it is. You can also hold down the right mouse button, scroll around a little bit, middle mouse wheel, roll out. Now for the buildings themselves. Runway there, pretty self-explanatory. You launch space planes from there, which you can design at the spaceplane hangar. Your launch pad, that's for launching your rockets, which go straight up. Your vehicle assembly building, where you design and build said rockets. And you've also got your tracking centre, where you keep track of everything that you've launched. On the astronaut complex, this is where you hire and fire your Kerbals. And this little building here, which isn't selectable, is where you plan your missions, or so I'm led to believe. Okay, well, let's get started first of all. I want to have a brief look at the Kerbal universe. This is the home world to the Kerbals, known as Kerbin. It has two moons, Mun, which is pretty similar to our moon itself. It's tidally locked with Kerbin, so the same face on the Mun will always face towards Kerbin. Slightly further out, you got the Mun of Minmus. It looks like, big dollop of mint ice cream, really. And beyond that, we have our own solar system. You got Eve, which is kind of a Venus analogue. You got Moho, similar to Mercury. Juno, similar to Mars. Dres, which is similar to Ceres, I think it's called. You got Elo. Now, Elo is actually going to be circling a gas giant at some point in the future, but at the minute it's currently just floating around in space, in a similar resonance to Joule in that they don't cross each other. You see on here it looks like they might crash into each other at some point, but thankfully they don't. Now on to Joule itself. And here is a Julian system. You've got your inner planet, the water world, Lathe. You've got Val, which is kind of like a Europa analogue. Tylo, which is an absolute pig to land on. We've also got small moons of Pole and Bob. Now at some point I plan to be visiting all of these planets in the grand tour of the Kerbal space system. I'm going to be using one of my Colossus spaceships for that, which I'll come to later. First of all, kind of need to lay the groundwork for that. So back in towards Kerbin. Now what I really need to do is map out these Muns of Minus, Mun and Kerbin. And to do that I'll be using the Ice and Maps app plugin. So let's get started with that, shall we? To the Mun first of all, and start mapping there, and also looking for keythane deposits there, which is another mod. What it basically does is it lets you, it's in space on various bodies like planets and moons, and from that refuel your spacecraft, which is very valuable really if you're going to be exploring beyond the immediate confines of Kerbin. So to do that, here's one I made earlier, in true Blue Peter fashion. Just to give you a brief rundown of it. This part from here upwards is the satellite itself. It's got an RTG, solar panels to provide power, the keythane detectors, and the actual map sat itself on top. Lowering down you've got the main stage, liquid fuel engines, solid rocket boosters on the outside. You may not believe it to look at it, but this thing can get to Kerbin, Mun and Minmus, and possibly beyond as well. I haven't tried that really. Just goes to show you, you don't have to make your rockets, or anything for that matter in Kerbal Space Program, overly massive really. But it's a hell of a lot of fun when you do. So let's get down to launching this thing. And then finally we get one into Kerbin orbit as well. What the ISA Mapsat does is it basically maps out the surface of the planet, showing you terrain elevations and also any anomalies that are present in the game. And there are quite a few of them. They're well worth checking out. But first of all, since I've actually got MechJeb on, it's kind of messed up my control. So I'll control from the start of it. ASAS on. 3, 2, 1. Down to a 45-degree angle, just slightly higher. And that's essentially a gravity turn. See, it's no good just going straight up into space, because all you'll do is just come straight back down again. What you need to do is get up, sort of into orbit around the planet, which is, how to describe this? It's kind of like you're falling into the planet, but you're going that fast that you're falling ahead of it. No, that's one example that's been used to describe it. It's not that far off the truth, really. So essentially what I'm doing now is building up horizontal speed. At the same time, I'm trying to build up the altitude to get out of the thicker part of the atmosphere. At the top there, that shows thicker part of the atmosphere runs to around 12 kilometers. That comes at about 30 kilometers. So at around 30 kilometers I'm going to start leveling off. I'm just focusing on just building up speed really to get into orbit. One of the handy things about MechJeb, bring up things about orbital info, very useful tools. They'll make things a lot easier for you to use it. There's a lot of purists out there who say don't use MechJeb. I use MechJeb. NASA uses MechJeb. Well, it doesn't actually use MechJeb itself, but use flight computers. So just coming up to 30 kilometers up now. I'm just going to swing down. And now build up speed to get into orbit. We're out of the thicker part of the atmosphere now. That's the reason I go more or less vertically straight up near the start of it, because you'll lose a lot of speed due to air friction. Once you get out of the thick of the atmosphere though, that's when you can start punching into orbit. I've also got parachutes on there, so let's return safely. I think I'm high enough out of the atmosphere now. I can use my solar panels. And in the rear view you can just see the remains of the probe we just left behind. The main launch stage of it. Look in the bottom right, you'll see we're actually building up an apoapsis, which is basically the high point of your orbit. And a periapsis, which is basically the low part of your orbit. And what you really need to do in order to be in orbit is have the apoapsis and the periapsis above the the atmosphere. And on Kerbin, the atmosphere finishes at 69,077 meters above the ground. So if you're above that, in both apoapsis and periapsis, you're in orbit. If your periapsis is slightly lower than or just inside Kerbin's atmosphere, then it will start to drag you and slow you down, which is essentially what aerobraking is. But as we're going into space, we don't really want to be aerobraking right now. And that's it, we are now in space. What I'm going to do now is plan an orbital manoeuvre that'll bring me into orbit. It's a little too low on a periapsis. Move this a little higher. 99 by 97, that's close enough. Now once I've laid in my course there, you'll get a little blue dot there. Swing your pointer around to point into the middle of that. ASAS on. What I'm going to do now is just time warp to the start of the burn. 15 seconds of burn. Now half of that needs to be before the node and half needs to be after the node. I'm just going to save it and walk round to there. And this burn will just complete the getting into orbit stage. A little bit more than I needed there, but oh well, it's good enough. And here is our satellite in orbit around Kerbin. Looking kind of lonely and empty in space at the minute, but I plan to launch a lot of things, so I'll make up for that. Now, getting to the moon itself. Now I can do this pretty easily with the orbital manoeuvres. First of all, by clicking on the moon, setting it as a target. And what I want to do is burn just as the moon's sort of coming up over the horizon, which is round about here. I'll basically put my spaceship on a course that's just ahead of where the moon will be is at the minute, i.e. where it'll be. Just a little fine tuning of this. Perfect. What I'll do now, first of all save, then swing round to the blue beacon, ASAS on, and just time warp ahead. Until I get to close enough to beginning my burn. I think in the days gone by, when the Apollo astronauts were travelling to the moon, what they did was wait until the moon came over the horizon. And that's when I was first playing KSP, that's how we managed to get to the moon before the manoeuvre node was present in the game. Let's get a nice cinematic shot of sun rising over Kerbin. Okay, so estimated burn of 58 seconds. So when node gets around onto about 30 seconds, that's when I'll be doing a burn. There's a crater over there. Essentially where a large asteroid or something may have struck Kerbin in its path. Which might be why they're actually going into space at the minute, just to see if there's any other dangers to them out there. of course a danger to us on Earth as well, if maybe slightly over dramatised. Sure, people have seen films like Armageddon and thought, oh crikey, gonna have one landing any minute now, but no, for the most part space is, well, space really, it's empty. There's of course always a risk of something hitting us, like I did in Russia just recently. We've seen all the videos on the internet about that. For the most part though, there aren't any massive asteroids wandering around that are going to collide with Earth anytime soon. Perhaps the danger comes from maybe some of these smaller asteroids that we can't yet track. You can see, burning on this side of the planet, raises our apoapsis, on the other side of the planet. What I'm actually doing here as well, see the yellow circle in there? That's the direction I'm currently going, travelling in. There's another one where it's a green circle with a cross in it. That's the opposite direction to where I'm going. That little pink thing shows my current target where it is. That's perfect. And now we're on our way to the moon. See the Kerbin's planet slipping behind there. Now with the IsoMaps SAT plugin, if I put it into an equatorial orbit even, all I'll get is a map of the equator. What I actually have to do is put it into a polar orbit, which is basically one that goes from north to south as opposed to from west to east. Sounds complicated, but it's not really. Like I said, the moon got a bit of a make. Looks a lot better, really. Now, what I plan to do is just slow down enough to get into orbit, but not into a circular orbit just yet, for reasons that I'll show in a second. What I'm going to do is going to be a laser here, and tell MechDev to point towards a node. That's bang on. I'll do save it. Zoom in. Oops. Yeah, I can recover from this. Perfect. And now we are in orbit around the moon. It's not one I can map with. It's one I can use a high point of the orbit to change the inclination at. The reason I'm changing my inclination at this point, at the apoapsis, as opposed to the periapsis, is because it'll take less delta V, which is basically your fuel in space, or how much it costs to change your velocity. I'll do. I can do this the easy way, or I can just get MechDev, tell MechDev to do it. Program it into MechDev and it'll change my inclination. And what I'll do it the manual way. Now to change my orbiting from roughly equatorial orbit into a polar orbit, what I need to do is thrust a right angle to the direction I'm travelling in. Easy way to do this. Putting Apple to north. Fire up the engines. Now, because my direction I'm travelling in is actually changing, I'm having to move slightly around, but that should just bring us into a nice polar orbit. Like such. Now what I'm going to do is 137 kilometers up is probably a little too low for mapping. What I'm going to do is going to raise it up to about 250, something like that. So in order to do that, point my spacecraft in the direction I'm facing. In this case now the north relative to the Mun, and just apply a little thrust. That just brings your periapsis up a little bit. And from there another orbital manoeuvre just to slow us down. By slowing down there, it lowers the apoapsis where we're currently at. You can do better than that. Can take a little bit of fine tuning with the manoeuvre nodes. Well worth having a play around with though. They make things quite a lot easier when you're travelling between planets and moons. As already mentioned earlier, in the early days of KSP we didn't have these, so and I appreciate them when they're around. What I want to do is just save, walk round to here. Also notice on the map screen the Kerbal map scan. I'm going to be using that in a second. Now we just bring ourselves down into a nice polar orbit. 249 by 254, it's good enough for me. If you click the show grid overlay, I'll show you a Kerbal map of the Mun. At present completely blank because we haven't started scanning it yet. But we'll start scanning now. Activate detector. I'll just disable the scan tone for now. And what we want to do is just time warp, because it will take a while to start mapping up. And see, look as has it, we've actually hit upon a deposit right there underneath us. Green areas show the Kerbin and how much is there. White areas show where there's nothing. And also I mentioned the ISA map sat. Now this isn't a new save, and I've actually mapped out the Mun on a previous one. So here's one I prepared earlier. And that is the map set of the Mun, which shows the terrain elevations. You got your lowlands, you got your sort of mountains in towards the north and south pole. And if you click anomalies, it'll also show you any anomalies in the game, such as Easter eggs. There are quite a few scattered around the Kerbin system. Well worth checking out. And this is basically the starting stage for exploring the Kerbal system, as I call it, with the sun being Kerbal itself. First of all, I need to start refueling in space. I'm going to need to refuel my interplanetary craft once I actually launch it from Kerbin. So the Mun will be the base of operations for that. Of course, that's going to be in the next video. So I hope you've enjoyed what you've seen so far. Like, comment and subscribe if you like what you've seen. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you.